Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Narayam Namaskritya Naram Chaiva Narottam Devim Saraswatim Vyasam Tato Jayam Virye Nashtaprayeshu Vadreshu Nityam Bhagavata Sevaya Bhagavati Uttam Shloke Bhaktir Bhavati Naishtaki. So continuing with the discussion on Srimad Bhagavatam, Canto 11, Chapter 28, Jnana Yoga, text number 27 onwards. Tathapi Sangha Parivarjaniyo Guneshu Maya Rachiteshu Tavat Madhbhakti Yogena Drinena Yavat Rajo Nirasyeta Manah Kakshaya. Nevertheless, until by firmly practicing devotion service to me, one has completely eliminated from his mind all contamination of material passion, one must very carefully avoid associating with the material modes which are produced by my illusory energy. So one must carefully avoid associating with material modes until we are come to the level of ruchi or asakti in service. The word tathapi in this verse indicates that even though the material nature is non-different from the Supreme Lord, as elaborately described in this chapter, one who has yet to conquer material desires should not artificially associate with material things, declaring them to be non-different from the Lord. So although everything is the energy of the Lord, but material things can still distract our mind if we are at the beginning stages. So not being careful, we can get distracted again. Thus, one aspiring to be Krishna conscious should not loosely associate with women, claiming them to be non-different from the personality of Godhead. For by such imitation of the most advanced devotees, one will become a sense gratifier. Such imitation of most advanced devotees, like Srila Prabhupada. Prabhupada could associate with his disciples, ladies disciples also, but he would not get distracted or attracted by them. But we can. A neophyte devotee who presumes himself liberated is impelled by the mode of passion to become falsely proud of his position, and thus he neglects the actual process of devotion service to the Lord. One must have firm and steady engagement in the loving service of the Lord under the direction of the higher authorities. Then advancement in Krishna consciousness will be easy and sublime. So all one has to do is be very, very careful. Yatha mayo sadhu chikitsito nirnam punna punna santu dati prarohan evam mano apavakashaya karma kuyoginam vidyati sarva sangam. Just as an improperly treated disease recurs and gives repeated distress to the patient, the mind that is not completely purified of its perverted tendencies will remain attached to material things and repeatedly torment the imperfect yogi. Sarva Sangam refers to one's stubborn attachment to material objects of so-called enjoyment, such as children, wife, money, nation, and friends. One who increases his attachment to children, wife, and so on, although supposedly performing devotional service to Lord Krishna, is understood to be either a kuyogi, as described in this verse, or a bewildered neophyte who has failed to properly treat the disease of the heart called material attachment. If one has repeated relapses into material attachment, he has failed to eradicate the darkness of ignorance from his heart. And see how Krishna is explaining kuyogi. Kuyogi means he's not perfect yet. And in that he says, or in the purport he says, attachment to children, wife, money, nation, and friends. So nation also. It doesn't mean that we work against India or here in America. Too much attachment is problem. Because then the issue is we have to take birth again. A yogi means complete attachment with Krishna. That's it. Nothing else. Kuyogino ye vihitantaraya manushya bhuta stri dashopasrishta te praktanabhya sabalena bhuyo yunjanti yogam natu karma tantram. Sometimes the progress of imperfect transcendentalists is checked by attachment to family members, disciples, or others who are sent by envious demigods for that purpose. But on the strength of their accumulated advancement, such imperfect transcendentalists will resume their practice of yoga in the next life. They will never again be trapped in the network of fruitive work. Sometimes sannyasis and other spiritual teachers are bewildered by flattering followers and disciples sent by the demigods to embarrass spiritual leaders who are lacking complete spiritual knowledge. Similarly, spiritual progress is sometimes checked by attachment to one's party relatives. Although an imperfect transcendentalist may fall down from yoga practice in this life, he will resume it in the next life on the strength of his accumulated merit, as described in the Bhagavad Gita. So Bhagavad Gita says the next life, if a yogi has made little progress, he will either get birth in a rich family, or he'll be attractive, or very well educated. But if he leaves the body after making good progress, then he is born in the house of the transcendentalists, where he continues again till he gets perfection. The words natu karma tantram indicate that a fallen transcendentalist does not have to pass through the lower stages of fruitive activity and gradually be promoted to the practice of yoga. Rather, he will immediately resume his yoga practice at that point at which he left it. Of course, one should not presume to fall back on the facility offered here, but should try to become perfect in this lifetime. Sannyasis especially should remove the knot of lust from their hearts and should avoid falling into the clutches of flattering followers or female disciples sent by the demigods to expose a so-called spiritual leader who is imperfect in Krishna conscious knowledge. So the testing will always be there. So testing will be there. But it just one has to be very, very careful. Flattering followers or female disciples, that's something sannyasis or any devotee actually has to be very, very careful of. Karoti karma kriyate cha jantu kenapi aso chodita anipatat na tatra vidvan prakrito sthito api nivritta trishna swasukhanubhutya. An ordinary living entity performs material work and is transformed by the reaction to such work. Thus, he is driven by various desires to continue working fruitively up to the very moment of his death. A wise person, however, having experienced his own constitutional bliss, gives up all material desires and does not engage in fruitive work. By sexual association with women, a man is driven to enjoy the female form again and again, and indeed he remains lusty up to the moment of death. Similarly, through association with family and friends, the knot of material attachment becomes very tight. Knot of material attachment. It's so hard to untie it. Thus, the reactions of fruitive work bind more and more in the cycle of material defeat. But a learned person, who's in touch with the Supreme Lord within his heart, realizes the ultimate frustration of material work and the danger of entering the womb of a pig or dog in future life as a result of sinful activities. One on the platform of self-realization does not regard himself as an enjoyer of the world. Rather, he regards the entire cosmos as simply an insignificant expansion of the Lord's potency and himself as the Lord's humble servant. But an ordinary living entity performing fruitive work, karmic activities, he is driven by various desires, so many desires to enjoy. So that is where knowledge, self-realization, yogic practices, they come into picture, that these are worthless desires. We can never be happy following these or trying to enjoy these senses. We can never be. Tishtantam asinam utvrajantam shayanam akshantam adantam annam svabhavam anyat kim pihamanam atmanam atmatirna veda. The wise man whose consciousness is fixed in the self does not even notice his own bodily activities. While standing, sitting, walking, lying down, urinating, eating, or performing other bodily functions, he understands that the body is acting according to its own nature. So he's not at all attached, because his mind, consciousness is fixed in the self, completely absorbed in Krishna consciousness. Yadi sma pashyatya asad indriyartham nananumanena viruddham manyat na manyate vastuteya manishi swapnam yatothaya tirodadhanam. Although a self-realized soul may sometimes see an impure object or activity, he does not accept it as real. By logically understanding impure sense objects to be based on illusory material duality, the intelligent person sees them to be contrary to and distinct from reality, in the same way that a man awakening from sleep views his fading dream. So a sane man can clearly distinguish between a dream experience and his real life. Similarly, a manishi or intelligent person can clearly perceive polluted material sense objects to be creations of the Lord's illusory energy and not factual reality. This is a practical test of realized intelligence. So polluted material sense objects, well, they are polluted because if we want to enjoy them for ourselves, and they're transcendental if we want to use them in service of Krishna. They all can be transcendental or spiritual. But an intelligent person, a manishi or a self-realized person, he can see the difference. Purvam grihitam gun karma chitram ajnanam atmanya viviktam anga nivartate tat punarikshayava na griyate napi vishrujya atma. Material nations, which expands into many varieties by the activities of the modes of nature, is wrongly accepted by the conditioned soul to be identical with the self. This is false ego. Material nations means the ignorance. And we in this ignorance only, we think, I am this body. But through the cultivation of spiritual knowledge, my dear Uddhav, the same nations fades away at the time of liberation. The eternal self, on the other hand, is never assumed, never abandoned. It is emphasized here that the eternal self is never assumed or imposed as a material designation, nor is it ever abandoned. As explained in Bhagavad Gita, the soul is eternally the same and does not undergo transformation. The modes of nature, however, create the gross material body and subtle mind as a result of one's previous fruitive activities. And as a result of one's previous fruitive activities, one develops that kind of consciousness. So because of consciousness, the first the subtle body takes a shape of the next body, and then the gross body is covering on the subtle body. Thus, a living entity can neither assume nor reject the soul, which is an eternal fact. Rather, he should give up the gross ignorance of material consciousness by cultivating spiritual knowledge, as indicated here. Yatha hi bhanurudyo nrichakshunam tamo nihanyana tu sad vidhate evam samiksha nipuna sati me anyatamistaram purushasya buddhe. When the sun rises, it destroys the darkness covering man's eyes, but it does not create the objects then they then see before them, which in fact were existing all along. Similarly, potent and factual realization of me will destroy the darkness covering a person's true consciousness. So, when the darkness is removed, we see clearly. In the darkness, we don't see. In darkness means ignorance. So when the realization or proper knowledge is there, then it removes the darkness. In darkness, we can think I'm this and I'm that in ignorance. But when the light is there, we know who we are. So in the real knowledge, real realizations, then we know who we are. I'm an eternal servant of Krishna. Esha Swayam Jyotiraju Aprameyo Mahanubhuti Sakalanubhuti Eko Advitiyo Vachasam Virame Yene Shitavag Savascharanti. The Supreme Lord is self-luminous, unborn and immeasurable. He is pure transcendental consciousness and perceives everything. One without a second, he is realized only after ordinary words cease. By him, the power of speech and the life airs are set into motion. The Supreme Lord is self-luminous, self-manifested, whereas the individual living entity is manifested by him. The Lord is unborn, but the living entity, because of material, designative coverings, takes birth in conditioned life. Although the soul is not born, soul is also a Janma, but the body that we get every time is different. That is material body. The Lord is immeasurable, being all pervasive, whereas the living entity is localized. The Supreme Lord is Mahanubhuti, the totality of consciousness, whereas the living entity is a tiny spark of consciousness. The Lord is Sakalanubhuti, omniscient, whereas the living entity is aware only of his own limited experience. The Supreme Lord is one, whereas the living entities are innumerable. Considering all these contrasts between the Lord and ourselves, we should not waste time like the foolish material scientists and philosophers who struggle to find the origin of this world by their insignificant mental speculation and word jugglery. So there is no hope of achieving absolute truth by such petty endeavors. So by him, by Krishna, the power of speech and the life airs are set into motion, not by us. Etavan atma sammoho yad vikalpastu kevale atmanarite swam atmanam avalambo na yasyahi. Whatever apparent duality is perceived in the self is simply the confusion of the mind. Indeed, such supposed duality has no basis to rest upon apart from one's own soul. So as explained in text 33, the eternal self is neither assumed nor asked, since every living entity is an eternal reality. Every living entity. The word vikalpa or duality here refers to the mistaken idea that the spirit soul is partly composed of matter in the form of the gross body or subtle mind. It is thus that foolish persons consider the material body or mind to be an intrinsic or fundamental component of the self. So those are foolish persons. And all the scientists, philosophers, psychologists, they always talk about the mind and this and that. But we are not this mind. The mind is material. We are above the mind. In fact, the living entity is pure spirit without any tinge of matter. Consequently, the false ego, which is generated by the false identification with matter, is a mistaken identity imposed upon the pure spirit soul. The sense of ego or I am, in other words, the sense of one's individual identity comes from the spirit soul, because there is no other possible basis for such self-awareness.
By studying one's false sense of ego, one can analytically understand that there is a pure ego. If the false ego is there, then it has to be pure ego also to be there, which is expressed by the words Aham Brahmasmi. I am pure spirit soul. One can easily understand in a similar way that there is a supreme spirit soul, the personality of Godhead, who is the omniscient controller of everything. Such understanding in Krishna consciousness constitutes perfect knowledge, as described here by the. So I guess I will stop here. It's just way too technical knowledge, not stories. So anyway, I'll stop here. See anybody has any questions or comments. Okay. You all have a safe and wonderful day. Hare Krishna. Jai Shri Ram.